Namit Malhotra's Ramayana has been going through a rough patch in the last week or so. First, a trailer event for a select audience took place in New Delhi, which was well received, but subsequent leaks of the trailer footage led to a divided audience on social media. Next, the trailer was expected to release on July 24th, but it was postponed. And now the team has showcased Ramayana at San Diego Comic-Con, and the reception has been positive, but the leaks from the event have started spreading on social media. But amidst all this, there is one promotional material which caught my eye.
And you gave out today at your Comic-Con panel this con-exclusive graphic novel explaining Ramayana to those who are getting to know it. This is awesome.
At both trailer events, all the attendees were given a special edition comic book, which is an introduction to the rich world of Ramayana. I got a copy through a friend, and after going through it, I realized that the book is much more important than it initially appears. It pretty much sums up the two promos we have seen, but it has a lot more visual language, backstories, kingdoms, forests, and the look of the characters. This comic is not introducing us to a new universe. We already know this universe. We know Ayodhya, we know Lanka, we know Lord Ram, Ma Sita, Ravan, Lakshman, and the broad journey of the story. But it is giving us a glimpse of how the makers are imagining this story. So the real question is, how do you create curiosity for a story whose ending the entire country already knows? In the past, I have criticized Namit Malhotra's marketing for the Ramayana, especially with the bold claims of the budget.
It'll be about $500 million by the time we're done on both films put together, which is over 4,000 crores.
Wow. But of late, the messaging has changed, and this is where the strategy of Ramayana becomes genuinely fascinating. And in this video, I want to explain this strategy through this comic book, what was my initial reaction, why it is being done, and what could be the impact. Starting by telling us what Ramayana teaches us.
Ramayana is going to take you on a roller coaster ride of emotions, and on top of that, a few very valuable life lessons.
The book has a detailed page on what is the Ramayana, what it teaches us, why it is relevant today. And honestly, this was the perfect way to set up the comic book. No conflict, no drama, just straight to the core essence of the story. The one page I loved was Lord Ram's journey across India shown on a map. The book has details about Ayodhya, Lanka, Mithila, Chitrakoot, and the visuals are amazing. I want to mention that part 1 of the Ramayana will have a few extremely emotional moments.
Lord Ram leaves for exile. It's a very emotional moment. The whole of city is out there not wanting him to leave, crying along with him. It's something which gets me emotional every time I see it.
But one other scene whose visuals we can see in this book will be when Bharat comes to meet Lord Ram in the forest, pleading to return to Ayodhya and take the throne. This scene in Ramanand Sagar's Ramayana was very emotive, and I'm sure in Nitesh Tiwari's Ramayana, this too will be very emotional, and the comic book proves that just from the visuals. Like we saw in the first promo, there are detailed pages of Lord Brahma, Lord Vishnu, and Lord Shiva, and it has details like the weapons Ravan received from these deities, and also tells the boon Ravan got from Lord Brahma about how he couldn't die at the hands of gods, demons, serpents, or spirits, which set the stage for the events that unfold in the Ramayana. Details like the Ayodhya family tree, which actor is playing which character, the Pushpak Viman, and I loved the last page and the line, the ultimate battle of light versus darkness. In my honest opinion, the makers should release this comic book for everyone to buy and keep it as a collectible. And this brings us to the original question I asked earlier. How do you create curiosity? Almost everyone in India already knows the broad story of Ramayana. This is not a story where the audience is waiting to discover the basic plot. When you watch a normal fantasy film, the marketing can ask simple questions. What is this world? Who are these characters? What is going to happen? But Ramayana cannot create curiosity in the same way. The audience already knows what happens, so the makers have to create a different kind of curiosity. They have to make us ask, how will this film show the story? How will this version portray Lord Ram and Ma Sita? How will Ravan look like? How will the forests, kingdoms, creatures, and battles look on screen? What will be the emotional tone? Will this feel like a straightforward retelling, a grand fantasy epic, a spiritual story, or something that combines all of these elements? That is the real challenge. The audience is not asking what happens to Lord Ram. The audience is asking how will this film make me experience a story I already know. And there is another layer to this. For Indian viewers, Ramayana is not simply a story. It is part of our culture. Different generations have encountered it through television, books, theatre, family stories, religious traditions, public celebrations, and conversations at home. That means every new adaptation arrives with expectations already attached to it. People already have an image of Lord Ram. They already have an image of Ma Sita. They already have an image of Ravan and the major battles in their own minds. So the makers are not starting with a blank canvas. They are entering an audience's existing imagination. And this is where the campaign has to establish something very specific. What is the visual identity? What is the emotional tone? What is the cinematic point of view? The comic book does tell us a lot about this. It is giving us the design of the characters, it is giving us the look of the world, it is giving us a sense of the costumes, the locations, the creatures, and the weapons. The campaign is effectively saying, this is how we have imagined the story. That is a very different promise from saying, here is a story you have never seen before. The story is known, the cinematic interpretation is what remains unknown. And this is where the special edition comic becomes important. As a marketing decision, the comic is smart because it introduces the interpretation before the movie has to carry the full burden of that interpretation. The makers are not trying to explain the entire story again. They are trying to explain their version of the story. The second major part of the campaign is the way Ramayana is being presented internationally. The film has been showcased at San Diego Comic-Con, and the global presentation is clearly meant to communicate that this is not being treated as an ordinary domestic release. The makers are not assuming that audiences outside India already have the same familiarity with this story. In India, Ramayana is part of our cultural history, but for a large number of international viewers, that familiarity does not exist at the same level, which is pretty natural. They may have heard the name Ramayana, they may recognize one or two characters, but that is very different from having an emotional connection with the story. And this is the real global marketing challenge. Before the makers can convince international audiences that this is an exciting new cinematic interpretation, they first have to create interest in the world of Ramayana itself. This is why taking the film to Comic-Con is strategically important. Comic-Con is not simply a place to show a trailer and receive applause. It is a platform where audiences actively search for new fantasy worlds, new characters, and new cinematic experiences. For Indian audiences, the campaign is saying, you already know this story, now see how this film interprets it. For international audiences, the first message is slightly different. This is one of the great stories of India. Here is why its world is worth discovering. That is a much bigger job because the makers have to create curiosity before they can create attachment. The international strategy follows a clear progression. First, create awareness, then build curiosity. After that, provide context, then establish familiarity, and finally deliver the emotional connection through the film itself. The comic can help with the third and fourth stages. For international viewers, the comic can function as the first entry point into a story they may know very little of. It can introduce the characters, locations, creatures, and the visual language in a simple and accessible format. The audience does not have to begin a 3-hour film and immediately understand every relationship or cultural reference. The comic gives them a first step. It offers a visual map. That initial context can reduce unfamiliarity, and reducing unfamiliarity is extremely important when marketing a film outside its primary cultural audience. The makers are not changing the story to make it global. They are creating multiple entry points for people who may not know the story yet. The comic creates curiosity, Comic-Con creates awareness and discovery. A globally recognized composer like Hans Zimmer can create a sense of familiarity for audiences who may not yet have a personal connection with the story. The film's scale creates spectacle, and finally the film itself has to deliver the emotional connection. That is the complete progression. It tells international audiences that Ramayana is not being presented as an obscure story hidden inside Indian cinema. It is being presented as a major cinematic event with the scale, ambition, and production value to stand on a global stage.
There's a shot of you like swinging on a branch with like a creature and it reminded me a little bit of Legolas in Lord of the Rings.
Like you said, Steve, it's nothing less than Lord of the Rings. It's our greatest epic spectacle coming from our country.
The most interesting thing about the comic is not just that it contains familiar characters, it is the additional details surrounding the world. Details like Ravan's pet, Krodh, Marich, a demon and an ally of Ravan who played a key role in the abduction of Ma Sita, and the confirmation of the fight sequence we saw in the Lord Ram trailer, which is happening between the Devas and the Asuras, the Dev Asur Sangram. Now, the important point is not whether every single detail will become a major part of the final film. The important point is what these details tell us about the maker's approach. They are not presenting Ramayana only as a sequence of the most familiar events. They are trying to establish a larger dramatic and visual context. This makes sense from a filmmaking perspective. If the movie is supposed to feel like a major epic, the world cannot appear to begin and end with only the central characters. The audience has to believe that there are histories, regions, creatures, rivalries and forces surrounding the main journey. When we see Krodh, Marich, the Devas and the Asuras, the world begins to feel larger than the plot points that everyone already knows. This is one of the main advantages of world building. It gives the audience the feeling that the story existed before the camera arrived. Ayodhya has its own identity. Lanka has its own identity. The forest is not simply a background, it becomes a space with its own dangers, creatures and emotional meaning. That level of distinction matters because a large-scale film cannot feel like a collection of disconnected sets. The locations must feel like parts of one complete world. But this is also where the film must be careful. World building is useful when it deepens the characters. It becomes distracting when it only exists to create more information. This is the difference between a catalog and a living world. A catalog gives you names and designs. A living world gives you consequences. The comic is also showing us the scale of ambition. The makers appear to be saying that this is not a small retelling built around a few famous scenes. This is an attempt to create a complete cinematic version of the epic. That ambition is exciting, but it also creates responsibility. Once you show the audience this much detail, they start judging the film before watching it. They start asking whether the visual language is consistent. They start asking whether the characters belong to the same world. They start asking whether the design choices have meaning or are simply there to look expensive. So the comic functions in two ways. It creates interest and it creates a promise. The comic also solves another marketing problem. How do you show the scale of this film without revealing the entire story? A trailer has limited time. It has to create excitement quickly. It has to introduce the main characters, show the visual effects, establish the conflict and still protect the emotional journey. That is a lot of information to communicate in 2 or 3 minutes. If the trailer tries to show every character, creature, kingdom and weapon, it can become overloaded. The audience may remember the images but not understand the emotional purpose behind them. The comic gives the makers another space to build that understanding. It can introduce the world slowly. In a way, it can act as the first trailer. Not a trailer in the literal sense, it does not show movement, performances, music or action, but it performs a similar marketing function. It gives the audience a first look at the film's interpretation. Is the world grounded or fantastical? Does Ravan's world feel different from Lord Ram's world? Does Ayodhya feel like a kingdom, a spiritual center or a grand fantasy city? Does the forest feel peaceful, dangerous, mysterious or all three at the same time? The comic begins answering these questions before the film has to answer them on screen. For Indian audiences, this changes the nature of familiarity. We already know who Lord Ram, Ma Sita, Ravan, Lord Hanuman, Jatayu and Marich are. So the comic is not asking us to identify them. It is asking us to examine the choices made around them. What does this version add? What does it emphasize? What kind of visual and emotional world is being created around characters we have seen many times before? This is a much smarter way to market a familiar story. The makers do not need to pretend that the audience has never heard of Ramayana. They only need to convince the audience that this particular interpretation deserves to be experienced. The comic becomes a conversation starter. People can discuss the artwork, they can debate the character designs, they can compare the look of Ravan with the versions they grew up watching. In other words, the comic creates a layer of discussion before the actual film arrives, and that is extremely valuable in modern film marketing. A large film needs more than just awareness, it needs conversation. The audience should already be discussing the world before the the trailer drops. That is how anticipation begins to build.
बात तो सही है.
That is my take on the marketing strategy of Ramayana. The comic is a smart way to introduce the film's visual world, but its success will depend on whether that world leads us back to the characters and their emotional journeys. Let me know what you think of this video in the comments below. Subscribe if you haven't already and check out our video on Ramayana and its budget right here. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.